If you're just joining us, we'll get started in just a minute. So please go ahead and feel free to introduce yourself in the chat while we wait. Okay, if you've just arrived, please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. We're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. And welcome to today's webinar and guest presentation for AI Academy 2024. I'm Sean Michael Morris, Vice President of Academics at Course Hero, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you. For those of you not familiar, AI Academy is a 4-week professional learning program offered by Course Hero. It's our effort to support teachers faced with the questions that generative AI raises. This week in AI Academy, we're working on developing professional statements that reflect our policies and approaches to AI in the classroom and that we can share with students. Today's webinar, while open to the public, is also part of the coursework of AI Academy. Hannah Kapoor, our speaker this morning, will help us to understand how students want us to talk to them about generative AI, and will surface some important issues related to student success. Hannah is a recent Princeton School of Public and International Affairs alum who specializes in technology policy and journalism, focusing on tech governance and generative AI adoption. At Princeton, she was a prominent student leader, serving as a peer academic advisor and vice president of the Undergraduate Student Government, where she championed academic initiatives. Hannah's a frequent presenter at Course Hero events and always brings valuable and sometimes surprising insights to her audiences. So if you have questions about anything she discusses today, please post them in the Q&A for the session, and we'll have some time toward the end of the session to address those questions. And so without further ado, please welcome Hannah Kapoor. Hannah, thank you so much for joining us today. The stage is yours.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Sean, so much for that very generous and kind introduction. I'm really excited to be speaking with you all today. First, it's always a pleasure to just be working with Course Hero, but it's also just really exciting to be talking to educators about what's become such a prominent and pressing issue, not just in education, but kind of globally in every aspect of the workforce. So my goal for today is, I know that it's been a really busy past few weeks at Course Hero. There's been an amazing lineup of guest speakers. I know we had Amanda Bickerstaff teach AI 101. I know Professor Stephen Keltz was with you all next week. And even if you're just joining in for this session, I know there's a lot of content out there about how to use AI for the first time, how to think about the ethical implications of AI in the classroom. And while all of those are super important conversations to be happening, my goal for our session today is to kind of just take a step back and just talk as person to person, student to, teacher, and just talk about kind of the culture of the classroom and the different attitudes that are surfacing as we kind of approach this question of AI, which for some is really exciting, but for some students and even educators, it can be really scary and anxiety inducing because it kind of plays out differently depending on, the student to teacher context, the subject area. And my goal for us today is really just kind of to take all those considerations into perspective and really just talk about kind of the attitudes that are at top of mind for students and see if somehow we can kind of dig into those and see how that might frame our approach to really implementing AI in the classroom for the first time. So I guess to kick us off, right here we have a little roadmap of what we're going to be doing. Most of our time together is going to be delving into various student perspectives on AI. I had the pleasure of going into the field and talking to students from several different universities across several different majors and kind of asking them, their past experiences with AI and kind of their overall perspective on the subject matter. And then we're going to talk a lot with one another about kind of what our ambitions are and so on and so forth. And so I guess to kind of start, perhaps this might frame a little bit more into my perspective on the subject matter. I'd like to just share briefly my background involving AI. So as Sean mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, I'm a very recent graduate. So I really love talking about this subject matter with educators because I think my perspective was quite interesting because it was on the cusp of right before everything changed. So I went through most of my education not knowing AI existed. It didn't really become accessible to the everyday person until I was a senior in college. So I went through, traditional learning, and then when I was a senior, ChatGPT came out. Everybody was taken aback and confused, and I actually had the opportunity to pivot my senior thesis to kind of delve into what the implications of AI would be in governance a little more. Now that I'm a few months post-graduation, I actually work at a technology and economics research firm where some of the primary work I do is generative AI adoption across various industries. So I've had the option to look into what are the implications of adopting AI for manufacturing, for financial services, but also education. And I have to say, out of everything I've seen in my short time in the workforce, I think education is the most fascinating use case because it's really not just about maximizing outcomes, where I think where a lot of the conversation around AI is. It's about optimizing well-being. It's about optimizing learning. And I think it's so important that teachers like you take the time to have these conversations and really be proactive about what the implications will be in education. So, just to start on a really general note, one thing I always like to think about when considering kind of the unique and perhaps even nuanced impact of AI in the classroom is how it compares to other instances of technological innovation. So, the example I always go back to is handheld calculators. So, I don't have the firsthand perspective on this, but I would imagine when, calculators first became accessible to the everyday student, there was a lot of concern about how this would influence mathematical literacy. Would students just no longer learn how to multiply because they have these calculators in their hand? And that might be a little bit hyperbolic, but I think it's really important to kind of acknowledge this trend of reaction, this trend of initial anxiety and maybe even panic, and then think about how adoption has worked throughout the years. So, handheld calculators are a very perhaps oversimplified example of that, but we see similar trends throughout time. And so, I have all this on the screen for you, kind of outlining different reactions and adoptions of different technologies I thought were super relevant in the classroom, just kind of to see how we can kind of wrestle with how we think AI is different or the same. And I'd actually be really curious to hear your perspective on this in the chat. If you think, hey, is generative AI to you, is it just like another handheld calculator? Are we going to learn how to work around it? Or is something about this really different? And maybe even what specific questions does generative AI specifically raise? So I think the examples of calculators and the Google search engine, which you see on the screen, are really interesting because they challenge literacy. Interactive whiteboards, when I was doing a little bit of research for this, that was really interesting to me because whiteboards were something that really challenged kind of accessibility of tools and the cost and the implementation of bringing something like a very expensive whiteboard to classrooms across America. So we see that throughout time, there have been different instances of technological evolution, and everyone, I like to believe, has changed education for the better. Maybe you would disagree on that front, but it's interesting to see how we can do this compare and contrast of how it kind of wrestles with the overall changing in the learning environment. So yeah, I know some of you have already put some of your thoughts in the chat, but kind of building onto that before we dive into the different student perspectives I've gathered, I'm really curious to hear what is the general sentiment you've heard in your own network? Do you hear more excitement from students? Do you hear more anxiety? Maybe if not students, what are you hearing from your fellow faculty members? And we'll just take a moment. Please feel free to put your comments in the chat, just sharing what you think. Okay, so it's interesting. It's very assuring to me to hear from you all the panic of calculators in classrooms because that was something I was wondering about. But we do have there is a bit of discourse in the chat. So a lot of people think it's an accurate comparison. Some people say it's massively different because of the personal, on the level of personal computers. Okay. It depends on the discipline. Okay, so we see some sentiment that faculty want to ban AI altogether. Students are just using it, faculty are figuring it out. Most faculty are against AI. That's faculty equals worry. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of that, and that's actually really interesting because when we dive into the student perspectives in a moment, I think we're going to see some misalignment there, which kind of makes sense. All right, thank you all so much for sharing kind of those different perspectives about AI. So I see a mix of curiosity. I do see a lot of anxiety, which is very valid. Um, and I really appreciate kind of some of the comparisons you guys have put in the chat. Some of you are like, yeah, it's just like the calculator, we'll figure it out. Some of you are a little bit more existential about it. It's like, yeah, this is completely different. And I think all of the above are correct. But what is assuring to me is that there is a mix of sentiment. That's my main takeaway from a lot of the comments in the chat. More anxiety than excitement. People are expressing ethical concerns. Yeah, it's all super interesting. So yeah, to kind of pivot a little bit. So now we know a little bit about what we're feeling in this community here at Course Hero. A lot of the time I want to spend with you guys is just talking about what students are sharing. So in preparation for this webinar, I actually had the opportunity to talk to schools from right now you only see 9 universities, but it was 12 different universities just across the country, in some cases, other parts of the world. And I basically asked them similar questions. How are you using AI? How do you feel about AI? What kind of interactions have you had with your professors? And so I'd like to preface this part of the webinar by saying, I'm going to show you a couple of statistics that I gathered from my survey and findings. At the end of the day, it is a very small sample size, so it is by no means all inclusive of what all students feel. And I think we also get a sense of that from the different opinions and viewpoints we see in the chat. But I think it's still illuminating because you're going to hear from students from community colleges, from large state schools, to small liberal arts colleges, across all disciplines. And what I see here is actually quite consistent with what I just saw in this chat, is that a lot of it really depends. It depends on what you're studying. It depends on your familiarity with technology. It depends, honestly, I think, kind of in the culture and environment of the academic program you're involved in. And so here is kind of how everything breaks down at a glance from these student perspectives. And I would like to take a moment just to go through a couple of these statistics. And if anything stands out to you as particularly surprising, I would love for you to flag that in the chat. Some of these, I think, were pretty consistent. Of the students I spoke to, 75%, I think the survey is still open. It might have been 80% when I last checked in on it, have already used AI-powered tools to aid in their academic tasks. And this question was asked without reference to, what policies do you have? What are your teachers assigning to you? 75%, potentially 80% of students have already used or experimented with things like ChatGPT and Gemini, which kind of tells us that, students are thinking about this. It's probably something that they're going to be using or thinking about, regardless of what, educators consider in their classroom planning. 57% of students considered increased productivity as the primary benefit of generative AI for their learning, and 63% of students considered it to be most helpful in STEM subjects. And I think out of all of the statistics here, this one metric, 63% relating to STEM, that was the most surprising for me. And I see that some people also put that in the chat. Because, yeah, when I think about Gen AI in the classroom, I always assume, the anxiety in the initial use case is, oh, I can use ChatGPT to write my essays. But that's not actually what people were saying. I found a couple of instances of students using these tools, to help them crack a math problem. For my more like computer science, STEM-oriented students, they thought it was very helpful in generating code or kind of learning the fundamentals of coding or cross-checking their data analysis, however that related to their assignments. So that was a really interesting, surprising statistic. One that I'm actually really hopeful for us to talk about more later during this call is that 28% of students reported feeling uncomfortable discussing with the experimentation of AI tools for their assignments with their professors. And I think out of everything here, that's the one statistics that is perhaps the most actionable for the community here in this room. my personal belief is that students are probably going to experiment with AI and wonder about AI no matter what we do. Um, but as educators, if there's anything here on the screen that we think is the most promising point of intervention, I think it's that 28% statistic is how can we make students feel comfortable, more comfortable, or maybe we are of the belief that these tools should be banned altogether, but it's really how do we foster kind of a classroom environment where students are a little less afraid of talking about their experimentation um, regarding these tools. So over here, we have some initial impressions of students on generative AI. So I guess one perspective I'd like to hone in on is kind of the student from Florida Atlantic University. It was a computer science student who says, I believe generative AI has made learning easier. It can break down complex topics and provide examples for math problems or coding algorithms so you can understand things in a much simpler way. And so I'm kind of comparing these perspectives to what I'm now seeing in the chat. Some of you are really surprised that a lot of the students were even aware of AI. A lot of you are skeptical of how students will kind of just use AI to completely mitigate the most fundamental critical thinking tasks in their assignments, like reading articles. And I think it's all really valid. And I think those perspectives also should be taken with a grain of salt along with these ones, because none of the students I spoke to were probably going to be very open about any shortcuts they were potentially taking. But despite that, I think some of these sentiments are really valid. Students are curious about AI. They want to be able to use it. Even if they haven't used it before, they want to try it because it's something that everybody's talking about. Every time you go online, you're hearing about a new way. This goes beyond the classroom. I think one thing I see on social media a lot is that there's always a new AI toy. There's an AI generated filter. There's an AI way of creating images. So if students aren't thinking about these tools in the classroom, they're thinking about it beyond the classroom in the context of their current lives. So I think that, it can be a given that a lot of students are definitely interacting with these tools in some capacity in their lives. And it's only natural to wonder how that might interface with the classroom environment. One perspective I think also worth highlighting on this slide is the one on the bottom left-hand side, where the student says, I think a lot of students are genuinely curious about AI, but fearful of how their professors might consider their usage of it. So this is something that I've actually spoken about extensively in previous sessions with Course Hero, is kind of the student fear surrounding AI usage. So a moment ago, when I asked you all for your perspectives of what you've seen in your network, there definitely was, I think, a prevailing sentiment was this mix of anxiety and fear of how are my students going to use this use this without my full understanding of it as an educator, or kind of to mitigate the critical thinking components of their work. And I think kind of the parallel perspective to that, from the student point of view, is am I going to be criminalized for being curious? And I think that in of itself is a very loaded area, but it's a very valid one to consider nonetheless, because it's a different type of fear and anxiety that is specifically unique to students. And, one thing we can talk about, during the Q&A or otherwise is the different tools and different safeguards that are being introduced to education to mitigate that cheating. But one thing I think that these student interviews are very illuminating of is kind of, the sentiment of being discouraged to explore these tools that are really relevant and have a lot of practical implications in real life, because you don't know, bottom line, nobody wants to get in trouble at school. And so, kind of pivoting from that a little bit, I'd be really curious to hear your perspective on this poll about what your biggest hope or aspiration is regarding the use of generative AI in education. So, one thing we saw from students is that they're really excited about the productivity gains. We saw that they're a little hesitant to explore because they don't want to be accused of cheating. Some students really like it because it helps them summarize things, and the extent to which they use or abuse that is up for debate. But as an educator, I'm curious, what is your biggest hope or aspiration? And is that somehow related to what brings you here today? And I'll give you guys about a minute to complete this poll. All right. I think we can end the poll right there. Okay, we have some really interesting results. Okay. So what we see from our poll right here is that about 42% of you describe your biggest hope surrounding generative AI to be to improve the learning outcomes and comprehension of your students. And I think the second runner-up would be enhancing student engagement and motivation. And I think of least concern of the aspirations I outlined for you guys was to reduce teachers' administrative workload. And so I think I'm actually very pleased with these results. I think it makes a lot of sense that as educators, you aspire to improve the learning outcomes of your students. I'm actually surprised. You guys are very generous. I'm surprised that reducing administrative workload didn't have a higher primary. Maybe that's not the primary aspiration, but I think that's also a generative AI. I think educators should be a little more selfish in that regard. But that's super interesting. Thank you all for participating in that poll. So maybe you'll be surprised to see, but when I asked a similar question to students, their primary aspiration for AI was to reduce their own workloads or, and see enhanced creativity in the classroom. So of the subset of students that I worked with, 57% of them considered it to be their primary benefit, whereas only 28% thought enhanced creativity was the main goal of using these generative AI tools, and only 14% were really interested in that line of, the personalized access to tutoring and whatnot, which is a huge conversation in education. And so what's really interesting here is just first, I don't know if the disparity between student priorities and educator priorities were different. Give me one moment. But it is interesting from this perspective because it gives us a good sense of how students want to be using these tools to begin with. And I think what it also sheds perspective into is as educators, what's going to spark the most student interest and where might students need to be pushed a little bit more. So first thing I'll say there is I know, especially as part of AI Academy, there's been a lot of work and conversation about, how can we use AI creatively in different assignments? And I think that's important. I would have loved to do assignments like that when I was going through school. But I think one aspect of this conversation that is a little more complex is that as an educator, do I want to encourage these tools? These productivities tools in classrooms? Is it necessary for students to need them? And I think that's a perspective that varies across discipline especially, but it also depends on the student. And so, you see some of these perspectives again on the screen. We have that computer science student who talks about generative AI being used once the basics have been mastered. And so what they spoke about, and we also did a phone interview, was that in computer science, I spend all this time writing code. And once I'm later in my education, they're no longer taking these, entry-level courses, having something to filter through my data, clean through my data, using a tool like OpenAI would be incredibly helpful. Another perspective that I thought was really interesting was this public policy student from Princeton who talks about AI being used as a supplement to kind of enhance the level of their work, but kind of tangential to their primary learning purpose. So they brought up the example of journalism. So traditionally, again, and this is a quote that I'm supplementing with anecdotal evidence, they say with journalism, if I'm given an assignment, I have 1 week, I need to do these interviews, I need to do the copy editing, I need to, write my story and whatnot. If I had access to AI, maybe I could run a survey and maybe the AI could help me do a little bit of a data analysis and create an even more compelling article. And that wouldn't have been the primary purpose of the assignment, but it would allow the student to go above and beyond and maybe dip their toe into something like data journalism, which is emerging in the workforce. And so that example, I think it's unique because it's an example of a student trying to go above and beyond rather than simply meet the criteria for their education. But it's interesting because it sheds insight into how AI in the classroom, it's not necessarily, these students aren't viewing it with tunnel vision. They're not saying, "Oh, I want this because I can do my homework faster or I can get my home, I can get this done out of the way without putting different effort in." It's like, no, this is going to help me brush up on the skill sets that maybe I've forgotten that aren't super relevant to what I'm working on, but really take my work and my learning to the next level. And I am just taking a moment because I like to read through your comments as we go through these slides. And I really appreciate one of these comments made by Aaron, where they say that I don't understand the fad to speed through an education. Learning takes time, and approaching education as a checklist or hoops that need to be jumped through isn't learning. And I think that perspective actually really supplements with what we're seeing here as well. Or maybe it contradicts it. I'm curious to hear what you guys think. There is a rush with students, to get your homework done faster, to get through your all these credits and complete the course requirements as quickly as you can. But there's also an aspect of being more creative with learning. And is this aspect of increased productivity? Perhaps it would fall into kind of your perception of students and your relative optimism or cynicism is this notion of increased productivity, is it a testament to students just trying to get things done faster? Are you pessimistic? Are you not buying it? Or do you think it does pave a path for students to be more creative in their learning, take more ownership over what specifically interests them by kind of cutting down on the busy aspects? And before we move on from this slide, one thing I will say is that it is surprising to see that students prioritize the increased productivity more than that survey or that poll rather we ran amongst just us with teachers. Teachers are clearly more focused on the learning outcomes, less so on how they can use these AI tools to minimize their own workload. And so I know that a lot of you have already, shared some of these perspectives in the chat, but I guess just to take a moment again, now that we've talked about, the different evolution of technological tools, whether or not we think generative AI aligns or misaligns with past innovations like the handheld calculator. I know there's a lot of discourse going on in the chat about that. We discussed kind of our primary aspirations, and we saw that students are really focused on this increased productivity aspect. Well, what do you think? What is your primary concern about integrating generative AI? Okay, so Frederick brings an interesting perspective. Does this disempower the student? Do they feel they cannot do it themselves? Mitch says students will not learn how to read or write. Lindsay is concerned if she introduces AI to her students that they will use it across the board for everything before they have the opportunity to make enough changes to my curriculum. Okay, Deidre introduces a really nuanced perspective. They share that there are different types of students who are using these tools. Someone might be struggling academically, maybe less interested in using the tool to support their learning and more interested in using it to just complete an assignment. Students losing their voice. I'm opening up Pandora's box. Learning it to live ethically. So yeah, thank you all again. Thank you for taking the moment to share those perspectives in the chat. And I think the overarching themes I'm seeing is this loss of critical thinking and kind of the ethical consideration of the sources used. And I think the latter kind of is well aligned with a lot of media, or I think in this case digital literacy is a more appropriate phrase, efforts that are going on, arguing that yes, before we introduce these tools, they need to be implemented with safeguards. The other part of it is that inherent to generative AI, there could be this existential loss in critical thinking. And as educators, how do we protect that? And what we saw from some of the student perspectives is that, they're less, I think in that way, students are a little more confident than teachers. I think that's innate to our age and kind of our difference in roles, is that, yeah, the student might not take the most ownership over their critical thinking skills. And what we see here, I guess before I dive into kind of like the specific case study, I think a specific perspective that I think, here I'm offering my perspective on that, is I think it's a huge issue. I think it's a lot of pressure to put on educators that, tell them, hey, you should introduce these tools, you shouldn't ban them, you shouldn't be afraid of them. Because, it's going to be super important for the workforce. The other part of it is, yeah, sometimes students just do take the shortcut out. And my response to that, and again, this is something that's super nuanced, is that I think what was once always true remains when it comes to navigating academic integrity. Students can take shortcuts. I think there's always ways, not just in the classroom, but in life, to take shortcuts out of things. But eventually, you have to reckon with your choices. So, the same way that plagiarizing an essay or cheating on your math homework, you know, would be detrimental to a student's academic success, maybe it wasn't. It's something that we discourage by kind of pushing on those ethical buttons of students. It's like, hey, you might be able to get away with it. And as educators, you might not be able to police everything. But what you can remind your students, I think, through conversation, is that just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. And just because it helps you in the short term doesn't mean it'll help you in the long term. And I think, a lot of these questions about critical thinking, they're exacerbated by generative AI. I think they are so profoundly valid. But at the same time, I think academic integrity and the notions surrounding that, and kind of leaning onto the moral principles of students, you might not be able to enforce them, but you can remind students that it does catch up eventually. I don't think that's changed as much. I don't think that's changed as much. Perhaps it's controversial, but part of me really does believe that there are only so many safeguards that educators can put in place. And then it's really up to the student to take ownership of their learning. And I don't know if that's a controversial opinion. I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are on that point. Um, but before we dive into more of an open discussion, what I do want to take time into is dig into two case studies of some of the students I spoke about. And what you're going to see on the following two that we're going to dig into is that they've had completely different experiences on AI in the classroom. And so I know so far in the webinar, we've spent a lot of time talking about the different anxieties, about how, people might use it differently. But right now, what we see here in action is how different attitudes in the classroom and different approaches might potentially be influencing student outcomes. So we're starting here with a computer science student from Florida Atlantic University. And one flag here is that the STEM experience is a little different. That was a pattern that emerged from my interview and survey process, because they're a little more savvy with Gen AI. They're thinking about it more than the average student because it's inherent to their discipline. But this student right here, they had very clear expectations surrounding AI usage. They shared they were always encouraged to use generative AI, especially in one of their elective classes. And the catch that their faculty member had put on them is that they had to list ChatGPT as a source, and no more than 60% of their code could be written by ChatGPT. And so had they done that, had they cited ChatGPT, they then had to provide a written explanation of the logic of each function. So what the professor was testing is not just that their application was able to run, is that the student understood what each line of code was doing. And so my first question hearing that was, okay, well, how does your professor know if it was only 60%? How do you know if you actually did it? Or how do they not know that the written logic also wasn't written by AI? And I think all those questions are very valid. And I think that's an example where you really have to lean on the emphasis of academic integrity. The principles behind academic integrity do not change with generative AI. I really strongly believe that. I think that's where a lot of the onus is put onto students. But what was really positive about this is that the student knew what was expected of them. So whether or not they decided to abuse the 60% rule, that was on them. But what the professor had done was said, hey, I know that my computer science students are probably already thinking about how to use ChatGPT. I'm going to them run with it. And hopefully a subset of them will actually engage with this tool in a healthy way. They're going to use it, which is probably what they're going to be doing in their programming jobs once they leave school and join the workforce, but I'm building in the safeguards where they can tell me how they're understanding the tool. And so I thought that was a really good example of just having clear expectations, even though their instructor probably had that uncertainty that my students might be abusing ChatGPT. They might be using it for more than 60%. The second aspect of this case study that was interesting was that the student was a little more confident about what AI meant in the classroom. They said that, AI should be used sparingly. They thought it would be a great tool for their teachers. I thought it was really interesting that they were thinking about their instructors. Whereas it was like, yeah, like it could help my instructors grade my assignments faster and give me feedback faster. Because one frustration that they had was how long it took for them to get feedback on assignments. And the student, what was also really interesting was them is that they had strong opinions about how AI should be used or should not be used. And those two factors together kind of contributed to this great awareness that the student had about the impact generative AI potentially would have on their career outcomes. And it would be a bit of a stretch. I don't know if there's a direct correlation between a student having clear expectations about how AI is used on an assignment and their confidence to explore AI in the classroom. But this student was really level-headed about where these tools were going to bring them in the years ahead. They're going to be starting a job in software engineering in just a matter of months. And they were like, you know what? Yeah, it's very likely that ChatGPT could increase the demand for software engineers in the future, especially software engineers that aren't super specialized or, maybe aren't the most advanced in their own field. And it was something that worried them, but the awareness they had, I thought was really astounding because they're going into the workforce with experience, with level expectations. They know what's out there, and they also know how they need to compete between these tools. And so I think this example is very specific to the computer science example. But that being said, I think the combination of kind of like this classroom culture was really illuminating about how it could potentially influence a student's post-classroom outcomes. So what makes that case study really interesting is how it kind of contrasts to this next one we're talking about. And so right here we have a marketing student from Cal State University Northridge, and they are in an environment where it is not AI friendly. I don't know if their university has a formal ban on ChatGPT or, its peer tools, but they described to me like AI is forbidden. They're like, I have not touched it. I have been told it's bad. It's very criminalized in the environment that they found themselves. This student was aware of AI. They had never actually tested it. But they were like, they're a marketing student there, and they told me, I'm like, yeah, I think it helps with creating content. I see that on Instagram. I use AI to make different things on social media, or I've seen AI to use. The student hadn't used any. So I know it's going to influence my future career in marketing, but I haven't touched it. The student was also a senior in their program. So that was interesting to me because they've been very discouraged to use AI. And when I asked them, would you be comfortable having a conversation with one of your professors? So if you had some kind of assignment where, in marketing, she's always making posters, talking to different people, making different pitches, would you be comfortable doing something as simple as using AI to create a graphic or a slide? Or is that something that you would want to talk to your professor about? And they said, absolutely not. They were like, how could you even propose that? She thought it was ridiculous to even ask her that question. She was like, that would just give my professor the impression that I wanted to cheat. Why would I even like open that door? And that was a really strong reaction. That was really interesting. Because not only was this student had the awareness of the field they were going into, they knew that AI was going to be relevant in their future job, but despite all that, they were like, I'm not talking to my professor about that. I'm not dipping my toes into this while I'm in school because I don't want to be accused of cheating. And that is really profound because the student has the awareness, but kind of this tension in the classroom, this fear in their environment is kind of, it's too soon to tell. We don't know what the student's career outcome will be. But I think a lot of what this interaction suggests is a little bit of uncertainty about how they're going to navigate various career outcomes. And what this begs to question, I think the student is very bright. I think they're going to be totally fine. Is that are these fears somehow negatively affecting career outcomes? So when this student graduates, AI is still going to be relatively new. But part of me wants to wonder if these attitudes persist over the next decade, is a marketing student going to be well equipped to join the workforce if they've never had the opportunity to dabble with AI, in any marketing related task? And so that's what I wondered by talking to this student. And I thought it was really interesting to compare their perspective to that computer science student from FAU we were just talking about, because we see clear differences across the student that's been encouraged to use AI and the student that's been totally banned from it. And I acknowledge that there's a lot of nuance. These are definitely generalizations. Marketing is very different than computer science. The student attitudes are very different. But it still goes to show that there is a potential correlation between all these different factors. And again, it begs the question for all of us here in this room, like, what are the potential interventions? And so I'm going to skip this question for a moment because I think it would be good for us to spend more time of it in the end. But I would love for you guys to populate in the chat if you're willing, what strategies you might employ to foster that culture of ongoing feedback from students about AI tools. So kind of that statistic about, the 28% of students that felt uncomfortable striking a conversation with their professor about how they might explore these tools. Where do you fit into that? Is that a conversation that you feel is worth having? Is it something you trust your students to even engage in? I'm really curious what your ideas there are. And I think just to do, just for a quick comment in the chat, all the students polled were in higher ed. And so kind of to draw all of what we spoke about together, on this slide here, you see a couple of recommendations that were inspired from these conversations with students about how to navigate AI in the classroom. And I think these three core recommendations, they might be I think they are oversimplified to a certain extent, but at the core of each of them is this idea of fostering a culture where AI is, I think, if it's not completely embraced, I don't expect everyone here to just go tell their students they can use AI for everything. But it kind of underpinning each of these recommendations is a notion that AI is inevitable in society. It will be framing the society, if not the classroom, it will be shaping the world that students go into. And it's how can we acknowledge that while making it clear by maintaining our expectations of students. So I think that one example of the coding assignment was really interesting, where the professor gave their students the space to use AI to a certain degree, but made it clear to them, whether they used AI for more than 60% of their code, that the idea of the assignment, you're not going to get anything out of the assignment, is if you use any more than what I've outlined to you. And I thought that was a really pragmatic approach to integrating AI with education. What that professor had also done was emphasize their key learning objectives. He didn't care how many lines of code his students could write. He wanted to know that they were understanding the logic behind each function. That was the true essence of their assignment. And I think that recommendation number 2, I think that's a really critical part about navigating AI in the classroom, is really seeing how it's going to challenge our current conceptions of learning, and how we foster that critical thinking. And it might be the case that the traditional assignments we've been doing for years on end, uh, sure, some of them might be replaced by AI tools, or students might be able to be more productive by using these different AI tools. But as educators, is there anything we can do to really hone in on what the key learning objectives are? And if we can do that, are we okay with students using AI for other aspects of their learning? So one thing I'll share here is that, as you might see in the bar above, I used AI to make these slides. I'm really bad at formatting things. And one thing I love about AI is that I don't have to do it anymore. I can really focus on the content. I was able to focus on the research of interviewing these students, of really hearing how they felt, and kind of formulating that feedback into these recommendations for you guys. And I didn't have to spend a lot of time on how, these different recommendations aligned. And I'm not in school anymore, so I can get away with that a little more. But part of me is curious if that's an example of something that resonates with you guys in the audience. Is that, depending on your discipline, is there a way that you can expose your students to these AI tools, but still isolate the experimentation of AI with your key learning objectives? Because that way, you are giving your students those increased, productivity gains that they seem so curious about. Is that something you're comfortable with? Because, again, you might not be. To a certain degree, students do need to learn how to use PowerPoint. You do have to pay your dues, but it's just an idea. And so the last thing that I'll share on this part is kind of fostering this spirit of communication and exploration. Because if we're going to uphold the notion that a lot of students are thinking about AI, if not using it already, to what degree, and again, this depends on our classroom environment, are we comfortable with students coming up to us and asking them, hey, this is what I'm thinking about? Is it okay for a marketing student to experiment with AI art for a poster they're making, while still meeting the learning objectives of their assignment? This is not something that, the entire responsibility needs to be on an educator to tell them how to use. But the question for you guys is that, is this a conversation you would be open to having? And again, I'll kind of close my, but before, we go into our discussion, I always like to close on the sandbox analogy when I talk about AI in the classroom, because whenever I come, to events like this and I speak to educators, a lot of people agree, but a lot of people are still rightfully so skeptical. They're like, I don't think this analogy is correct. I think generative AI is different. I think it brings an existential crisis to the classroom. I think kind of this, some of the comments I said about academic integrity, I think a lot of people might disagree with that fundamentally on a philosophical level. I think I take a definitely more pragmatic approach about, this is might be how about student attitudes. But if we take a step back from all that disagreement, and we kind of embrace the classroom as a sandbox, which I like to believe the classroom always has and always will be a sandbox for learning, maybe it kind of alleviates some of that anxiety we feel. And so I think in the case of generative AI, normally the classroom is a sandbox for students, to learn, to test ideas, to try and fail. But I think in the case of AI, it's a sandbox for both educators and students, because the fact of the matter is that generative AI is going to be changing the workforce. It's going to be changing the world we live in. And there's going to be a lot of stumbles in the classroom and beyond. And I think there's a lot of value in students and educators coming together and just starting to explore these possibilities of AI. And so, as I have alluded to throughout this conversation, I'm a big proponent in higher education. I think K through 12 is a completely different ballgame, of professors being really open, of trying these new tools in whatever capacity with their students, and fostering these open conversations, because I think if anything, it'll empower one another. And if we can create a space where it's not criminalized, in some instances, expectations need to be set. You can't use AI to do all of your assignments. I think it's a really positive and safe way to experiment with these tools that are constantly evolving. and they're going to impact all of our lives, hopefully for a better, but I think it can only be for the better if we're open to them and we don't shun what we're necessarily afraid of. And so I know I've spoken quite a bit, but I would love to open, for the rest of our time, you know, the conversation to you guys. I've said a lot. I know some of you have already put some questions, and I would love to just chat through about some of the stuff I said or anything else you think would be worthwhile to discuss. I'm just going to take a moment and read through the comments. I have the chat open and also the Q&A. Um, yeah, so one thing I will acknowledge is that, and as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, is that it is a small survey. I spoke to students from maybe, I think it was 13 different schools. And I tried to diversify as much as I could. I made sure to get some community college, some large state schools. We had, a couple of Ivy League universities. We had some respondents from like a university in China. But yeah, it is a small sample size. And one thing I did notice is that there are differences across students, not just academic year and discipline, but kind of the type of program that they're interested in. And that's actually something that I would love to dig into more. I think it's a really worthwhile question, is seeing how these perceptions change across demographic. And so it's I think that's a really valid criticism I'm seeing in the chat. And yeah, I'd be happy to share more of the nuances that I saw, but I think, yeah, the differences are really important to this discussion. Yeah, so Michael writes in the Q&A, have you surveyed community college students as part of your sample? Could you compare and contrast? So I spoke to some students at Moore Park College, and those students were more, there were still differences across all of them. I think the most prominent, I will say, is that while there are definitely differences across the degree program, you see the most in discipline. So the STEM students are definitely more savvy. It doesn't matter what school they're going to, kind of what class year they're in. Like, those are the ones using AI. They have a better grasp of kind of even like the ethical considerations to a certain degree. The community college student I spoke to, this one in particular, did have the attitude that, AI was very criminalized. And while they were curious, they presented the attitudes like, I'm really just trying to get through it. I don't want to get in trouble. And while that attitude was persistent across all the programs, there was definitely a higher concentration of that with a community college student. Lazarus asks, how do you think AI will transform education in the next decade? I think my first reaction, and I think this is actually completely independent to a lot of the things I've spoken about, is I think it will do a lot for education access, personalized learning, across. I think it'll really empower non-English speakers, and I think students from more marginalized and underprivileged backgrounds. I follow really closely with a lot of initiatives in the space, and even when I was younger, I loved Khan Academy. Um, I used Khan Academy to get through my secondary education. I used it for all my test prep, and now seeing the tools now that I see the tools that are coming out where students can leverage AI for personalized tutoring, I think that's a really, really, really positive outcome of generative AI in the classroom. So that's one thing that makes me really hopeful. I think kind of the personalized nature, my hope is that it will help students achieve better academic outcomes. But then down the line, talking about, I think, the classroom more specifically, I'm really curious to see what safeguards come out because I know companies like GPT-0 are working on some really interesting tools to kind of detect AI generated text. And I'm really curious to see if that becomes kind of like the new wave of Turnitin.com and like plagiarism checkers, or if those tools really just evolve how kind of assignments are assessed by educators. But I think there's a lot of really interesting innovation happening out there that make me feel very optimistic about the safeguards that will come out because I know cheating is a huge concern. But I do think the technology is still nascent. I feel like people might not fully trust them for a few years to come, which is completely valid. So Sharon asks, is there any age restriction for students under 18, dual enrollment slash early college entry using AI in the classroom? Um, I think there should be some age restrictions to a certain degree. And like one thing I will repeat, the students I surveyed and kind of like the target audience of a lot of my commentary was for higher education. And as I mentioned before, I think higher education is a completely different ballgame than secondary. I think uh, for high school students or people earlier on, you really do need to emphasize those critical thinking skills. So not only so you can learn how to use the AI tools, but also so you can have the digital literacy and kind of question you need to be able to question what the AI tool is giving you. And I know that was touched upon in an earlier webinar at the AI Academy, but I think that's a huge component to this entire conversation, which is equipping students with those media and digital literacy tools so they can they can assess not only the ethics of the technology they're using, but just also the credibility of it. Nobody wants to be citing information that's blatantly wrong because AI does hallucinate. And that comes with, building, the most fundamental critical thinking skills. So I absolutely agree. I don't think these tools should be widely embraced at certain levels, or it depends on the aspect. I think it would be really fun for high school students to be doing, what I did here, which was intentional, like experimenting with AI generated art and prompting. I think there are some, subliminal skills that come with that. But I think the more advanced tools, like the ones we talked about with, summarizing and editing and code generation, I think they're all, I think those are different conversations to be had. Oh, Lindsay asks a really interesting question. I think we'll take one more after Lindsay. But how would you address students who refuse to use AI in the classroom? I actually have never heard that before, and I would be really interested into learning more about the context behind that. Are there instances where students are refusing to use AI? My question to that, my follow-up question is like, why are students refusing? Is that something that a lot of people have seen? Is it because they don't know if they're going to be accused of cheating or, oh, okay, privacy reasons? That's really interesting. So that's something, that's something I wonder how that will evolve as students, or rather as universities adopt formal licenses with these tools, because that's something we're seeing in the workforce. Like I know a lot of companies, they do not want their employees using these simple AI tools because it's a privacy concern for proprietary information. So it isn't until, like for example, at my company, we weren't allowed to use it until we got like the co-pilot license. Um, and so I wonder if different educational institutions will be working on getting the licenses because those have more privacy protections. Very interesting. I learned something about the resistance to AI adoption. So I know we're almost at time, but one thing I will say here is that I'm so appreciative of all you just taking the time to come here to chat with me. The Q&A, the chat box, everything has been super active, and as a presenter, that means a lot. I've learned from you, and I hope that some of the perspectives I've shared have been helpful to you and your students. And I love that, I love that there were things that surprised us, and I love that there were things that, there might have been disagreements on. And I think it's a really robust and important area, but it's just so valuable to have educators who care and who are trying to be proactive about these conversations with their students. And so for that, just thank you. And I really appreciate you all making the time.
Thank you so much, Hannah. This was absolutely fantastic, as I knew it would be. You're amazing. So really great to have you back, and this was just spectacular. So really appreciate you taking the time with us today, and sharing your insights. And I'm sure that everyone will have a lot more questions in AI Academy as well. And I know there were some folks even from Course Heroes team who were here. So we're learning lots from you, and I really appreciate it. So thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And keep your eye out for other offerings from Course Hero as we go forward into the summer. We have our education summit coming up soon, and there'll be more webinars on the way. So, all right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.